everyone, and welcome to this Women in Science webinar, the second in a series this fall, co-produced by Genetic Engineering Biotechnology News and the Rosalind Franklin Society. I'm your host for part 2 of this series, Juliana Lemure. I'm a science writer at GEN. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're holding this online series to celebrate the legacy of Rosalind Franklin, who would have turned 100 this year, and highlight outstanding issues impacting women in science from some legendary female scientists. It's a pleasure and honor to have Rita Caldwell here to talk about her long career working in microbiology, her most recent work to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, and her terrific new book on sexism in science. After a short talk on her work, we'll be able to ask her about her own experiences, the book, and the messages she would like to pass on to the next generation of female scientists. I have a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First, part 3 of this series is happening next week on Wednesday, October 28th, when we'll have a presentation from Susan Hockfield, President Emerita of MIT and author of The Age of Living Machines. Also, I want to mention that part 1 of the Women in Science series, given by Matthew Cobb last week, is available on demand if you missed it. Also, I want to point out that our Women in Science series is co-sponsored by OnRamp and Horizon Discovery. Horizon Discovery drives the application of gene editing and gene modulation to enable you to identify the genetic drivers behind human disease, develop and validate diagnostic workflows, and deliver new therapies for precision medicine. Horizon offers innovative tools and services based upon the ability to modulate or permanently alter the function of almost any gene in mammalian cell lines. OnRamp Bio is a San Diego genomics company that developed the Rosalind Discovery and Collaboration Platform. Named in honor of Rosalind Franklin, the Rosalind platform simplifies the complexity of bioinformatics so that scientists can harness the potential of multi-omic data interpretation. OnRamp Bio is a founding member of the Rosalind Franklin Society Council of Corporate Leadership, which supports the careers of women and underrepresented minorities in the life sciences and related disciplines. Thank you to both great companies. Also, before we begin, I want to mention that we welcome your questions for Rita. Please just drop them into the Q&A of the Zoom, and we will try to take as many as we can. Now, I'll pass it over to the Executive Director of the Rosalind Franklin Society, Carla Shepard-Rubinger, who will introduce our speaker and get the program started. Carla, over to you.
Thanks, Juliana. I'm so happy to be here today to introduce our speaker. Before I do that, though, I'd like to share a few words with you about the Rosalind Franklin Society. It is open to scientists all over the world, and of course, named for Rosalind Franklin, whose work was crucial in the discovery of the structure of DNA by James Watson and Francis Crick. Franklin symbolizes progress for women in science, but her accomplishments were not recognized during her lifetime, awarded posthumously, nor are they completely acknowledged today. Yet because of concerted efforts of men and women, including the first webinar which Juliana just referred to, her story and research are starting to be included in every textbook in the field. Moreover, it is only in the past 25 years that her body of work has truly been acknowledged. Her name has been attached to a university, a medical school, several buildings and student dorms, lecture theaters, various prestigious medals and fellowships, and most recently, a future Mars rover and a commemorative UK coin. This story proves that we really can make change happen. The Society brings together leaders in science, women and men, to assure that women and minorities in science obtain the opportunities not afforded to Rosalind Franklin and the recognition she deserved but did not receive in her lifetime. Now let me introduce Rita, who is known to many of you, but I hope you will get a wonderful feeling for her work and her leadership from this lecture today. Rita is a renowned microbiologist at the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins, who served as the first female director of the National Science Foundation. Her worldwide recognition includes multiple awards, including the National Medal of Science from President George W. Bush. Through six decades and still counting, Rita has emerged as a renowned scientist from her early work in bacteriology and discoveries about how cholera survives between epidemics, with its continuing relevance today in addressing contagion, ocean science, and climate change. After the rejection of her first graduate fellowship application, she in fact changed her areas of study 6 times, avoiding roadblocks thrown at her feet by an entrenched male establishment. And she has emerged unscathed, productive, renowned, and still a champion for women and minorities in science. We're going to get things underway now, Rita, with a short talk so that you can fill us in on the research you have been focusing on recently. Then we'll have time for a chat and some of your perspectives on being a woman in science and your new book. So please, Rita, take it away.
Thank you very much, Carla. It's a great pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you and with the audience today. I wish I could be there in person, but that's the way it is with COVID-19. I'd like to very briefly go through some of the research that I've done over the last 40 or 50 years and show how it fits right into analyzing and predicting COVID-19. So if I may have the next slide, please. I'm going to talk about cholera, which I've been studying since my early days as a young scientist. It's an acute water-related diarrheal disease. It occurs in pandemics. The 7th pandemic, which we're in now, started in the 1960s, and it occurs in about 50 countries, affecting about 7 million people. We unfairly refer to the Bengal Delta as the home of cholera, but that's unfair because until 100 so years ago, we had cholera in the United States, in Europe, and really throughout the world. But we've learned how to tame it, to control it, by providing safe water. And one of the key findings is that this bacterium is naturally occurring in the environment. We probably can never eradicate it. We definitely can control it because we do that already because we have safe water in the United States, in Europe, and in most countries. May I have the next slide? So what I'm going to show is one of the very early discoveries back in the 1970s that the bacterium, as you can see in the slide, is really environmental. It's from the environment, and its host is the copepod. In fact, I call it a vector-borne disease. The difference is that this vector swims but doesn't fly. Now, as a woman scientist, this notion of Vibrio cholerae being in the environment was absolutely unaccepted. I got excoriated, impugned, made fun of, and even in meetings like the American Society of Microbiology, at least one of my detractors would say in a loud voice, "Rubbish." Well, we now know, and it's in textbooks, that the bacterium is naturally occurring and that it does occur person to person, but definitely the source is the environment. We made these discoveries in the Chesapeake Bay. We have the next slide. And we were challenged that this really didn't occur in countries like Bangladesh where cholera was endemic. So we did our work in Bangladesh. Sure enough, the bacterium we discovered is present in the environment, transmitted person to person, but the source is the environment. So that was the ability to prove what we had discovered in the United States about cholera to actually be existing in Bangladesh. May I have the next slide, please? So it occurred to me, now this is 20 years ago, this is about 1980. Landsat, the satellite, was launched. It measured chlorophyll, sea surface temperature, and sea surface height. Those were parameters that, from my work, made sense as a predictive capacity. So I worked with NASA, and again, I had to work with a team at NASA in California. Again, it was not really considered that satellites could be used to monitor infectious disease. But in any case, the team I worked with were terrific. And Brad Lobitz and the team there, we collaborated, and we were able to show that chlorophyll, because phytoplankton respond immediately to increased sunlight, become abundant. They're fed on by zooplankton, which cannot be measured by satellite, but you can do a prediction by measuring the chlorophyll. And then when the zooplankton bloom crashes, it releases lots of vibrios into the water column. And if the water is drunk without treatment, you can get cholera. So the next slide shows that, in fact, that publication 20 years ago was a very clear insight that you could measure parameters and build a predictive model for cholera, because the blue line is sea surface temperature, and the red line are the cases counted in the Bay of Bengal, in the villages in the Bay of Bengal. And the correlation was extraordinary, considering you're measuring sea surface temperature and chlorophyll and depth and so forth, and building it into a model and doing calculations. May I have the next slide, please? So we now use very sophisticated satellites that allow us to measure movement of populations, as well as a whole host of environmental parameters. And going from the 1996, from the first hypothesis to the present, you can see we are employing a very large number of highly sophisticated satellite sensors. May I have the next slide, please? And so we now have very successfully developed a model for cholera. We now know, from going back to the recorded data by the British colonialists in India to the very present, that when there is a long, very warm period of warm temperature, followed by a heavy rainfall in an area where there's very little good sanitation and very poor water security, there's a high risk of cholera. With this very sophisticated model, we were able to predict for Hurricane Matthew retrospectively. The left in the middle shows the risk map, and the right-hand map shows the actual cases. In the middle is Hurricane Matthew, and then the right is a prediction for Yemen. What happened was that we published our data on Yemen. A squib was written up by Scientific American. It was read by a British scientist at the British Aid Agency. He called us in the spring of 2018 and asked if we could collaborate, if we would give them risk maps every week. They would be able to locate physicians, medical supplies, water supplies, etc. And we were able to do just that. We have the next slide. So we were able, currently, we were able to predict cholera in Yemen, and we now provide UNICEF and the British Aid Agency monthly maps, and they locate their supplies according to the locations of highest risk. Now, what's this got to do with COVID-19? The virus, so not a bacterium, cholera is caused by a bacterium, but in the case of COVID-19, it's a virus that affects the lungs, the liver, the kidney, the intestines, even the brain, because one of the characteristics is of a very severe case of COVID-19 is loss of smell and loss of taste. May I have the next slide, please? We had developed a very sophisticated DNA sequencing and microorganism identification system. And we are now able to identify the SARS virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus, and its variants. May I have the next slide, please? And we're doing work analyzing for the state of Maryland studies of wastewater, because it has been shown by this slide, which looks complicated, but it really isn't. From the top to the bottom, on the left-hand side, you see the number of patients, 1, 2, 3, down to 41. Horizontally, the red line means that it was swab test positive. The yellowish line means that it is a stool positive. In other words, the virus continues to be excreted even after the swab test is negative. And in fact, the virus is excreted even when the patient is in pre-symptom cases. May I have the next slide, please? So as we had done in Bangladesh, measuring the presence in the environment, we are now measuring the presence of COVID-19, the virus, in the environment, in wastewater, in different areas, locations in the state of Maryland. May I have the next slide? And we're able to show the peaks of incidence in the wastewater, in the sewage, which is an indication that within 4 to 7 days, or maybe 10 days, there'll be cases actually showing up in physicians' offices or hospitals as in that time lag. Similarly, when there's a drop in the number of viruses picked up in wastewater, that suggests that the various methods of distancing, masking, etc., are working, and the economy can be opened up, and it provides a basis for the governor of Maryland to be able to make that determination. Next slide. More to the point, we have modified our cholera predictive model, and shown here is some of the early work we've done this year, a risk map on the left for COVID-19 for the United States from April through May, and on the right, the actual numbers of cases that occurred in the United States. We have perfected the model, and we are now publishing several papers on this work and making predictions as to when and where the risk of a second wave will occur. So I'd like to close by showing that, I have the next slide. I have described my journey through the graduate work, studies on cholera in Bangladesh and other countries of the world, through the time spent at the National Science Foundation as director. And while I was at NSF, I ran a classified committee advisory to the CIA and the FBI to track down the perpetrator of the anthrax bioterrorist event, and then eventually formed a company, Cosmos ID, which is doing well, but it provided as well some interesting, shall I say, experiences of being a woman in business. And then I close in the book with some advice. So I'll turn it over now to you, Juliana, and let's have a conversation about some of the topics and things that you're interested in and that the audience might find interesting.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much, Rita, for that talk. That was so interesting. It's amazing how people of so many different fields are turning their work to COVID-19, and everybody's coming together to help try to do what they can to stop the pandemic. So yes, turning to the book. So it's a great read for anyone, but especially for those who are interested in science or being a woman in science. It's a candid look at the sexism that you've experienced in your own personal stories and those of the women around you, the women and men around you. So of course, the first question, and it's so curious to know why now? Why? I mean, reading through your book, you've experienced sexism from the beginning up until now? Why now to write the book?
Well, it's a great question, because I did not start out to write a book about sexism in science. I started to write the book about my work on cholera, but I received a phone call from Sharon Birch McGrain, whom I didn't know, but who had called and said she'd like to write a book about my work on cholera. And I thought, wow, this is terrific. So we teamed up. Sharon worked as an investigative reporter, and I felt, because of all the experiences of negative reaction to whatever good ideas I might have, I wanted to make sure that everything was documented. So you will note, thanks to Sharon, that every step of the journey that's written up in the book is documented by interviews, by clippings, by references, etc. So we ended up, as we worked through the cholera story, we were turning to experiences of women who had contributed to my understanding of cholera, but then subsequently to other women in science. And we found that my experiences were not unique to me. They were shared by just about every woman scientist. And so that's how the book came to be a story of cholera, but also about sexism in science.
Okay, terrific. And how has the book been received? Have you received, messages from women in science, telling you about how they're feeling about it?
I'm amazed. I've gotten a wonderful email from a delightful woman in India who liked the book so much she wrote a lovely review and sent it to me, which was very kind of her. And then I've just received a very nice email from a colleague in Ireland, and she's preparing a review for the Irish Times. So I'm overwhelmed that the book has resonated, as I would expect, in the United States, but very much globally. And this is incredible, because the book is published in English. Of course, there's an audit book version, and I understand there'll be a paperback coming out later on in early next year.
Okay, terrific. I also just want to pause for 1 second and remind our viewers that if you have any questions for Rita, to please just put them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So Rita, is there anything that ended up on the cutting room floor that you wished had been in the book?
Yes, there was supposed to be another chapter about work in oceanography. I had some fantastic students. Jody Deming is one. She's also a member of the National Academy, and she's at the University of Washington. She and other students, we worked on deep sea microbiology. We made a variety of discoveries, including contributing to understanding that under adverse conditions, bacteria, gram-negative bacteria that don't form spores, will still go into a dormant stage. And this has turned out to be medically important. So I would love to have had that story in the book, and also all the collaborations internationally. I've spent so much time working with colleagues in France, especially in Italy, Carla Pruso and colleagues in Italy. And my first trip overseas was actually to Japan. And that led to 10 years of collaboration with the Ocean Research Institute. So I think the message that I'm trying to convey is that science is international, and mathematics is Esperanto. It's the common language of science, and that women need to be conversant in mathematics. You don't have to be an award-winning mathematician, but it is the language of science, and science is international, and it's a wonderful way to collaborate with friends in every country.
Speaking of oceanography, I want to jump to the chapter of the book, More Women Equals Better Science, because that chapter starts off with a story that I loved, where when you were for our audience, when you're the newly appointed director of the NSF, and somebody from the Navy comes to you and says, we have a project and we're going to have a team of oceanographers and they need to go on a submarine. And the chief oceanographer is a woman and she is not going to be allowed on the submarine. And I want for you to talk about what your response was, how you made that response, and then how, we can use that as an example of making real change.
Well, the story begins before I became director of NSF. NSF was funding studies with the Navy in the Arctic Ocean. It was a massive program, very many millions of dollars. The deal was the Navy provided the submarine and the logistics, and NSF funded the science. And it was about it was a hefty, I think it was about $50 million. And so the admiral, who turned out to be someone I knew, Admiral Gaffey, had made an appointment to see me, and I thought, oh, that was very nice. So when he got to my office, and then he raised the topic and said, well, Rita, he said, women are not allowed on submarines. And I just sat back and said, Paul, no women, no money. And his face dropped. And I said, look, this was right after Tailhook, which was a terrible event where there was a big party and women were treated very badly. This was a Navy affair, a Navy party. Anyway, I said, look, I don't want any headlines, nor do you. Let's work this out. And we did. It turned out to be terrific. But SS Hawkbill, the submarine, was actually based in Hawaii. And the chief scientist, Margot Edwards, her university was the University of Hawaii. So we worked out the arrangement that her technician would ride the sub to the Arctic Ocean and would make arrangements for all the equipment to be working, etc. And then Margot and the rest of her team would be flown to the base in the Arctic Ocean and would then join the sub. Well, the Navy, to its credit, turned it into a public relations effort. So the Secretary of the Navy and I and a whole bunch of us got invited to be flown to the Arctic Ocean and to join the sub for a couple of days, which was fascinating. So it ended up as an extraordinary series of discoveries by Margot. She published a number of papers, was promoted to full professor. The Navy benefited by learning a great deal more. We discovered a new, larger entry to the Arctic Ocean that was better for the submarine as a result of it, because Margot was using side sonar to map the bottom of the Arctic Ocean and discovered some prehistoric glacial gouges in the Arctic Ocean. So the whole thing turned out to be really a benefit to everybody. And it was done without any temper tantrum or any arrogant, unnecessary interpersonal bad feelings. It was all good, and it turned out to be terrific. And Paul Gaffey and I are still very good friends.
Terrific. Oh, I love that story. And also shows, right, that, just pushing and raising the point and saying, no, we need to work this out. We need to figure it out. Can really make a huge difference.
Well, there's another anecdote I can't resist telling.
Yeah.
When we all flew to the base and the submarine poked up through the waters and we all climbed aboard the submarine. And I was warned, I was told that, oh, you're going to find this very claustrophobic. I hope you don't mind, but the bunks are very narrow and so forth. And they didn't know that I'd been on 20 or more cruises, many cruises, and had run them. I found it very comfortable, but it turned out that the oceanographer of the Navy, who had been asked to join the cruise, was a great big tall guy, and he had not been to sea very much. He was about 6'5", I think. He got claustrophobic. He ended up spending the night sleeping in the lounge and could not hack it in the bunk. So I couldn't resist telling that anecdote.
There you go. Nice. All right, thanks. So let's just take kind of a long view here. I mean, what do you think has changed? I mean, probably several different things, but a couple of things that have changed for women in STEM over the last several decades.
I think, first of all, women are speaking up and out. And I think that is really important. And to the point, I don't think any sensible dean or department chairman is going to tell a young woman in STEM, pursuing a STEM career, that you can't have a fellowship because we don't waste fellowships on women, literally, which is what I was told. Now, they may think it. They may say, oh, well, they're all been given out and none's available, but they aren't going to be so overtly rude and so deliberately block the career. So it's more, on the other hand, it's more covert in that I think what we need to be well aware of is that the range of interferences and sexism is from the criminal, which is physical abuse, to what I call the clueless. And I think we need to make an effort to get rid of the clueless, where put downs, instead of praising a woman's intellectual capacity, but feeling obliged to speak about her looks or her clothes or whatever, which you would never do for a man, unless he was aberrantly dressed. Then you might say you're looking a little silly. But I think it's the covert, and I think the report published by the National Academy showing an iceberg. The tip is the open put downs, the physical attacks, the really crude statements, and then the iceberg below are all of those minor, hardly individually meriting having a big fuss over, but nevertheless still creating a real sense of lack of worth, a sense of lack of accomplishment, a sense that perhaps that you're an imposter and that science isn't for you, which is totally wrong. There's a kind of sense that you need to have a Y chromosome to be a scientist. Well, gentlemen, there are no intelligence genes on the Y chromosome. And my motto is that if you really want the best, you look at 100% of the population, not 50%, to pick the very best.
Definitely. Okay, Rita, I'm seeing the questions come in and they're so good. We're going to take a couple of questions, take a break from some of my questions and take a couple from the audience. So Jess has a question and she wants to know, what advice do you have to help women deal with colleagues that undervalue and undermine their work and opinions in the lab?
That's a really, really tough one, because really that's part of competition. It's part of those put downs to make sure you don't get ahead of him. My one strong advice for women is to get a posse. Get together with other women, just as Nancy Hopkins did 30 years ago at MIT, when she went around and measured all the labs and had the evidence that, in fact, women were being given smaller labs, less research money, less travel money, fewer promotions, et cetera, et cetera. She then went to a colleague, and they then brought together all of the women, senior women, which there weren't that many. I think there were 16 altogether in the entire faculty, several hundred, and went together to the president, um, who was very, very receptive. And it was the fact that it was not just one woman whining about something, but it was a shared observation. And sometimes the guys in the lab are well aware of what's going on, and they'll stand up for you too as well. I found that to be the case as I was going through. I had tremendous mentors. There were few and far between, but they were really helpful. So I think it's important to make sure that you're heard, and that you have a posse of like-minded women and men who will back you up and make your statement of declaring the actions or the remarks as offensive by having it be let's say a recitation calmly of what was said and what was done and how it affects your science, rather than simply breaking down and crying about it, which too often is a tendency for women to do. And I think by bringing this together with your posse, it makes it, I think, easier for you to stand up for yourself, as well as for the group to make sure it's understood. And I think it's important to do. It's very important to do. My generation was taught to swallow it, just forget it. Don't do that. But on the other hand, don't be a whiner. Make sure that you choose your battles and make sure that your evidence is effective so that you win the battle.
Okay, thank you. Carolyn would like to know if you've heard from men about your book, and particularly from men in high levels of power and science. And if so, what have they said? What do they say?
It's interesting. I have heard from men. I've noticed that on Twitter, the guys are responding as well as the women. As it turns out, guys get put down too, and they have their own grievances. And it's kind of interesting to see how some of the feelings that we have about how we're treated, very often guys, even these are big gruff guys, can feel the same way. I do have, I have to be candid. I do work with some males who continue to be obnoxious, but I use humor. And it's always interesting that if you can make them look silly, they don't like it. And very most likely they will leave you alone after that. You can do this in a subtle, nicely humorous way, but the folks around who hear it, get it, and they will grin. And occasionally women will send me a cell phone message, LOL, because they get it too. So I think it's best, and I think it was Alice Wang who is quoted in my book, who says, humor can get you quite a long way, and she's right.
And actually, Alice is joining us today, so.
Great. Yeah. Hi, Alice.
Okay, this is a great question too, because, women in academia are moving into women in businesses, setting up their own businesses, and are seeing different challenges in that realm. So George would like to ask, were there any obstacles for you in setting up your own company?
Absolutely. It was the worst experience of my entire life. The sexism that is rampant and disgusting in business It has to change. It has to stop. This is not good for the men or the women. It's violent in its verbiage, not necessarily in physical confrontation, but it's terribly stressful. I've got a lot of stories of other women in the book who have had. I like to quote Carol Nacy. She's great. She's founded 3 companies, and she's very successful and very, very smart. And she tells the story of over and over again when she was going to venture capital meetings to raise money. She'd come in the door, and some guy would say, "Hey, hon, would you get me a cup of coffee?" And then his face would drop when she's called up to make the presentation. I think business, the sexism in business, frankly, is quite disgusting, and definitely has to change, and it's much worse. It's very overt, very, very clear compared to academia. In academia, you have a sense of some decorum, simply because you have a lot of young people and around, and you have to, or at least until current administration, but we won't get into that. You have to have some sense of being appropriate in what you say and do, but somehow, especially in Silicon Valley, it seems to be do whatever you please and never mind who you hurt or who you offend, and that really is not good for business. It has been shown if you have women, diversity, not just women, but diversity on your governing boards and in your business, you're far more profitable. I mean, just think about it. You're then reaching out to the other half of the population who are consumers, who would be buying your product. So I think the change really is needed. Sorry to be so harsh, but it is harsh.
This is an interesting question too, also from our audience. As a PI, have you experienced sexist issues while mentoring your own students?
Well, I've had wonderful students. I've graduated over 60 PhDs. They're all gainfully employed, none's in jail. That's a pretty good record. I'm just kidding. They're wonderful students, and they're all doing well. Half of them were women. And I must say that what I found with women students, they would come and say they were going to do a master's. And I would say, well, why aren't you doing a PhD? And they'd say, well, I don't think I'm really able to do that. And after a while in the lab, it became very clear. And so I would convince them to convert to pursuing a PhD. And now they are professors at major universities and heads of companies and so forth. I think the men who came to work for me were men like my husband. It wasn't in their DNA to be misogynist or offensive. There were, I think, occasionally when we had visiting scientists from overseas, but then my students quickly corrected them. I didn't have to do it. So we had a lot of teamwork, and I think that was very, very helpful. I'm being terribly candid. I thought it's better to be candid, tell it like it is. So I hope that the audience will be kind in their quoting.
Yeah, no, we're asking because we want to know. So that's good. Okay, so Rita, you raised 2 daughters, and
Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about what it was like being a mother in science, and what impact do you think that had on your career? And also, what would you say to the young women scientists out there who are also thinking about having children?
I had a tremendous advantage. I married a really wonderful guy. We were married for 62 very happy years. I still miss him. He He was a colleague, a friend, a wonderful husband, uh, someone that we enjoyed being together, and we went through grad school together, and we postdoc together. And when we had our first child, I think Allison was probably 2 or 3 months old, and I was invited to give a lecture. I would have to be away a week. And I asked Jack how we'd manage. He said, "Don't worry." He said, I'll get along. I'll get along fine. We had someone who came in to babysit during the day, but he took care of Allison as a baby from 6 p.m. until 7 in the morning when Miss Kit would show up to take over for the day. So everything we did was teamwork. And he was very, very, very athletic. I can't say that I was athletic, but I loved jogging and sailing and all the things that we did together. We raced sailboats for 25 years. And it was wonderful fun because Jack was a superb sailor. But he liked to race everything, whether it was the shore, floating leaves, or our competition in regattas, which meant that you never relaxed until the race was over. But it was fun, and we worked together. And if you can sail through regattas and still remain married, you're good. You're really good. I remember one regatta. It was in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and the wind was 30 knots, and it was whistling. And we had the spinnaker up, and of course, it's a 2-man dinghy that we raced, and I had the spinnaker flying. And Jack kept saying, "Keep your eye on the spinnaker. Don't turn around. Keep your eye on the spinnaker." So we got to the turning mark. He said, "Okay." He said, "Douse the spinnaker." We rounded the mark, and when I looked back, half the fleet was capsized, and I screeched. And Jack said, "That's why I didn't want you to turn around."
Oh, indeed. So yeah, finding a terrific supportive partner sounds like really good advice. The advice I was given 20 years ago, I was a technician in a lab. And the advice I was given by a senior male colleague was just have one child, which was, if you want to be successful, you can only have one. So not advice I took to heart. I had one and then I had 2 more. So, but
I had 2 daughters.
So, okay. So let's turn, a little bit also to other things that, or something that women, is not equal for women, which is prizes and awards and funding. So you've received numerous prestigious awards during your career, but we know that women are far less likely to be nominated and to win. And this happens, every year still. I'm reminded of the photograph of Virginia Lee, who won the Breakthrough Prize last year. And at the award ceremony, she's on stage and she's just surrounded by men in tuxedos.
Right.
She's the only one on the stage. And this is last year, So what impact do you think that has on women? And how can we start to make a change in that?
Women have to nominate other women. I make an effort, a real effort, and Vicki, my assistant, who's on the call, knows full well that she and I spend sometimes 2 or 3 days a week. The nomination process for many of the awards is tedious and time-consuming, and letters of recommendation can take time, but it's really, really important. So I make a serious effort to nominate outstanding women for awards and for writing letters of recommendation. I think it's something every scientist should do, especially women. And I don't think it's as well understood by women, the process. Someone has to make the nomination. It just doesn't happen. In other words, if there's an announcement by say the National Academy or the American Society for Microbiology, that there's award, this kind of award and that kind of award, that out of the blue, someone's going to send a name in. It really takes time to get in touch with someone. And there's nothing wrong with asking a person that you want to nominate for their CV and actually to help you write it. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Guys do it all the time. And so I think it's important to do, because that then makes the public understand that the face of science is feminine as well as masculine. And it's really critical, I think. And it's especially important for little girls, because there's this terrible socialization that goes on around the world. For girls, when they're 6 or 7 or 8 years old, they're very interested in science. In fact, thank heaven, they're now even becoming interested in computers, because a lot of the toys now are computerized. But they're dissuaded. They're told, oh, well, science is for boys, or science is for very smart people. Well, half of the population is women, and there's some very smart women. So I think it's a critical thing for us to know. It's a responsibility, let's put it that way.
Okay, great. So Joanna would like to ask about imposter syndrome. So it's so common in women and in women scientists. And so what advice can you provide to try to overcome that?
I think it's important, and I find it even hard to do myself now, to differentiate snide remark from a genuine criticism. I think there's a tendency to think that whatever we do as women can't be as good or as worthwhile. And certainly without any attagirl comments now and then, there's a tendency to feel left out, particularly when recognition of performance in the laboratory seems to be hard to come by. I think it's important to be resolute and to know that what you're doing is important and to persevere. I think for me, I'm very stubborn. If I'm told that I can't do something and I know that I can and that it's the right thing to do, I just keep on doing it. I find a way. And 50 years ago, as some my age who may be in the audience will agree, it was really hard because you were literally turned away, almost physically. Today, there are a lot of opportunities, but the turning away comes from not being recognized. And if you really feel that you've been doing something deserving, it's not bad to ask a colleague to nominate you for an award or to serve as a reference for a nomination or for promotion or whatever it may be. And I think it's probably not a bad idea to read stories of, there are a lot of stories, Jocelyn Bell, Maria Meyer, read stories of women who really went through everything from sheer hell to lots of obstruction and kept on going. I'm hoping that will change so that you don't have to do that. But take heart, because you are not alone. And again, it comes back to a posse. When you are feeling really down, go join the advanced women's group on the campus, or go have lunch with women colleagues in the other departments. I'm sure women engineers find themselves quite lonely still, they're only about 17% of engineers. And women physicists can be lonely as well. So make on a campus, get together with other women in other departments, in companies, get together with women in other departments, other parts, divisions of the company. I gave a talk the other day to a team at LabCorp. Great group, great questions, and smart women doing good things. So there's a lot of us out there. Just go out and find them. Make friends.
Okay, great. Sorry, there was a great, okay, I'm just trying to find this great question from Christina. Do you have an example of where one of your male associates disregarded your observations to your face and then claimed them as his own? And, how have you been able to try to keep that type of credit stealing from happening over and over again?
This is a really important question. Yes, I did have that feeling, that experience. First of all, when we made the discovery of the viable but non-culturable form of bacteria, which is really important, many pathogens go into that, gram-negative, which are not spore formers, and would not be expected to tolerate adverse conditions and survive. In fact, bacteria, we're now finding from millions of years old sediments are still alive. When we made that discovery, we were taunted, my students and I, for years. It took 20 years for it to be accepted. It's now in textbooks. And the irony of it was when it started to become accepted, one of my colleagues who had been most vociferous and rude sent me a paper where he had stained a bacterium, well, the cholera bacterium in a stool sample when he hadn't been able to isolate it and said, see, I made that discovery before you did, which of course wasn't true. So you just have to laugh it off and publish more papers. That's one thing women have to do is publish. You can't just talk about it, you have to publish. And I do know the experience of one young woman who made the mistake of, at a meeting, she was a grad student, telling another grad student at a different university about the wonderful experiments she was doing. And that guy rushed home, did some more experiments and beat her. And he essentially cost her another year of research by stealing the work. I'm not going to give the name, but the person who might be listening knows who I'm talking about.
Okay, I have a couple of questions that have come in about your book. Is it available in the UK? Jenny just searched Waterstones and they don't have it.
Well, tell them they should get it. But you can get it on Amazon.
Okay.
And Amazon, okay. I think, is pretty much international.
And Ian wants to know where to get a signed copy of the book. Rita, can you sign over Zoom is the question.
Yeah, what I did, because I'm actually living for the moment in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with my daughter, who's a physician at Dalhousie Medical School and Hospital. What I arranged with Simon & Schuster is to sign a whole bunch of, 100 actually, labels that are affixed to the inside cover, and they are signed. And so they can be purchased from Simon & Schuster. But I will be returning home on Saturday. And if you want to send me a book, I'll sign it and return it gladly. I don't recommend it for Canada because Canada is wonderful in every respect, including Nova Scotia, where I'm staying. They have a huge billboard at the entrance which says, "Welcome to Nova Scotia. Fewer COVID-19 cases than the White House." Anyway, the post office here is very, very slow. So it takes a month because of customs. So I'll be back in the States on Saturday.
Okay, terrific. Well, Rita, we could talk to you all day, but unfortunately our hour is coming to a close. So I just want to say that this concludes part 2 of our Women in Science series. I want to thank you, Rita and Carla, for a terrific discussion. I want to thank OnRamp and Horizon for supporting this entire webinar series. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Please join us next week on October 28th for a live presentation and Q&A with MIT President Emerita Susan Hockfield. Also, I want to mention that today's event will be available on demand at links at our website, www.genengnews.com. And almost lastly, please keep your calendars open for December 16th and 17th, when the Rosalind Franklin Society will host a 2-day end-of-the-year virtual webinar to talk about more achievements by women in science, as well as the continuing challenges that we face. For everyone at Gen and the Rosalind Franklin Society, I'm Juliana Lemire. Stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.